No question.
All right. So, still in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, but we're moving towards the middle section of the verse. Going to get into some pretty meaty information, and which, of course, looking at all of it, we have been shown to us just how important it is that everybody has some knowledge of what the Bible says, because if you don't, as we're discussing in this section about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, if you go into the situation not knowing what God already says about it, then you end up going against what God's marriage plan actually is. Then when you actually find out, end up learning the truth, then you have to go back and end up correcting 5 or 6 different things, when it would have just been easier to start with this information, in the first place. So when we're considering just how vital this information is, being able to claim ignorance isn't going to be able to help anything. To come to this point, if you have entered into a marriage that you have no business being in, then you learn the truth, and then you don't get to say, well, I didn't know. You could have known. Everybody has a Bible. Just about every home has about maybe 5 or 6 that are just laying around. In fact, the people are not using them shows to a great deal. So as we said, this section of Paul's letter, questions about marriage, the answers are given in the view of the present distress, found in verse 26. We went through and we discussed the importance of these points and these factors, because we are wedded to Christ, how that we all end up being collectively his bride. So there's application for us to be gained from it today, even though we're not in this present distress. So verse 6, we have again Paul making a statement, but I speak this by permission and not of commandment. Now, Paul is going to discuss questions that are not asked to Jesus directly. And that distinction is made throughout this discourse. So when we're considering these things, and we're looking at it from the standpoint of this is by permission, not by commandment. Even when we're dealing in the areas of opinion, and to a degree, that's what we have Paul illustrating, because again, this is about the present distress. So with the present distress, I'm speaking this by permission, but even with his permission, this is still by inspiration. That Paul is giving permission, and that by guidance and by the authority that God is going to give. Verse 7, here's the permission. For I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. So some of this is being offered as advice, and that as a means of advice or expedient in view of this present distress. In view of everything that's going on, it would be best that if everybody was like me.
I have a question. We're not under this present distress, so why is it so in your mind? I'm trying to put this together about why is this so pertinent to us today. I mean, I can understand it's given a lot of information on marriage, and that's all good and well and good, but now these kind of things that he's saying here, since we're not under distress, why would this be so important to have here? That it's one of those things that
Well, it's one of those things that the distress could end up coming back up. And if we find ourselves in that time of distress, how are we going to handle it? So, we've been through one distress.
Yeah. No, I would understand that because history repeats itself, and there's always a chance. I mean, we're so close right now to coming back to that, but we're not. But I'm just wondering, because it's not for all time, and this is why people get so confused about some of these scriptures, because since we're not under that present distress, people take liberties of assuming things that are being said when they're really not.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because they're under this distress, then he's saying these things for this purpose back in this time of what's going on with them right then. So I was just always curious. I mean, I know that it could pop up again, but I know a lot of people come up with their own theories.
Right. And so even if you take the distress part out of it, when we get into the section about the a Christian being married to a non-Christian and the desertion that could take place. okay, we're not in the present distress, but you can still have an opportunity where a non-Christian is fed up with being with a Christian mate, and they just decide, well, yeah, I'm out of here. Okay, what do we do with that? Well, that's discussed in this section as well. So even, a lot of it is being living in present distress, but we still find ourselves making application with it because these type of things are going to happen whether we're in distress or we're not. And it's a great piece of information that we have to be able to deal with each situation as it arises. So yeah, so even though there's a lot of emphasis being made on the present distress, these things still can be applied even if there is no distress.
Yeah, I agree with that. Never mind. I just know that people take liberties because of what this is saying, but they don't take into account that it is because of the present distress that he's saying that it's better not to marry, because then you wouldn't have that burden of the marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Until people can get that into context, it's confusing to people, Well, why would Paul see against marriage? And I don't think he really is. Because most people can't have what he has if he has the ability to control himself.
Right.
A lot of people have to get married because they can't control themselves.
Mm-hmm. And we see how marriage is vital from the fact that if you're going to have an eldership, you have to have a man that's married.
Mm-hmm.
So right there, you would have a situation where being married is a superior position. It would be better to be married. But now we have it in the bit of a flip section where now it's going to be better to be unmarried. It's just because of the situation. A lot of people don't like that because they start looking at it from the standpoint of, well, you're dealing with situation. But a lot of the time, situations are going to have a bearing on what kind of decisions we make. And when it comes to marriage, divorce, and remarriage, that's really going to come into play. You're going to have to really break down the situation, and a lot of what is being discussed is not as cut and dry as what people would imagine it would be in their head. So go ahead.
Well, I'd like to stop and ask Jordan a question, but he's out of here. Because Ron was giving him some information about why you can get divorced and remarried again for other reasons other than fornication or sexual immorality.
Right.
And I was going to ask him, because if this is part of that stuff that Ron was saying, or if there was...
we're going to get into the section about the not being under bondage, where people start looking at this as being a third option. There's adultery is a reason for divorce, remarriage. Death is a reason for remarriage. And then a lot of people run here to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and they say, well, this is a third reason that Paul is giving, that if your mate leaves and deserts you, then you can be remarried. That's not what he's saying.
Your dad gave that excuse for Amber in her first husband.
Yeah, right. And also people think that once you get baptized, that automatically eliminates that sin and it makes it go away. But like Jordan and I have been talking at the shop, if you're a bank robber, I'm just making this one up. If you're a bank robber and you get baptized, for one, your baptism wasn't for real if you're still a bank robber the next day, right? So you didn't repent and turn away from your crime and your sin. However, it doesn't annul it if you're going to still continue in that sin. So it's the same thing if you're married for the wrong reasons to a woman that you're committing adultery with. Just because you get baptized doesn't mean that it nullifies your sin. Mm-hmm. And that's what I was going to ask you when you went in there about Ron.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what was it that he was saying, or do you remember?
I don't remember where it's at, but it's in Mark, where Jesus says, "You adulterous generation."
Mm-hmm.
He says, so all sin is adultery against God. So that's how he gets around the second, because you still ask for forgiveness for anything you do.
Right.
All sin is adultery against God. So when you ask for forgiveness for anything, I lied, I'm sorry, God, you're forgiven, right? You move on, you get better. Okay, so he uses that reasoning for, all right, well, it didn't work out between the first marriage, we can get remarried. Because he uses adultery and adultery in that same context. That's what he used.
Is this guy a member of the church?
Yeah.
Wow.
He's the preacher over
In
where my
Spokane.
kids left
Yeah.
because they were doing Zoom.
Oh.
And I wrote a letter
Okay.
to that bunch of people, which I probably should have stayed out of, but I couldn't help myself. They're putting my kids down and I didn't like it. They're making them sound like liars, and it bothered me a lot.
Well, I mean, so we've already looked at earlier in this letter how that Paul's already having to address stuff that the brethren are misapplying. Same thing in this chapter. I mean, we are seeing, so the very thing that we're reading in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 about not keeping company with everybody that's fornicator, that's not what Paul said, and that's what the brethren were thinking. So we've already looked at that, how the brethren are taking his information and misapplying it. Well, now we're right back in the midst of that when it comes to this section. And so I mean, it's just a thing of that, okay, even with the misapplication that people make of it, we just have to try to go in and try to clear it up. So I mean, so yeah, that one brother has a point that, yes, oftentimes, especially in the Old Testament, when Israel departed from God and transgressed against him, they were described as being adulterous. That they, attaching themselves to idols, they've taken another husband, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't then mean that you get to change what the actual definition of adultery is. Words mean things. So that's being used in a metaphorical or a signifying method, whereas the word adultery, as it's discussed in these contexts, is describing a specific thing. And that specific thing has specific consequences, which is if you are engaged in adultery and you're put away, then you become a eunuch for the kingdom's sake. You can't get around that. And trying to meddle with words and change definitions is a very, very poor way of trying to get around it.
And then he was telling me that he didn't have a dog in the fight, but then later on you find out Grayson told his dad or whatever, I don't know how I found out, but his son is remarried, so he does have a dog in the fight.
Yeah. That's usually how it goes.
So
Somebody gets messed up in it, and I've had to restudy it and change my view on it. And it's like, really? No, that's usually a big red flag that goes up.
Yeah.
All right.
It's pretty sad to think that our brethren out there are just, I don't know, they're weak. And I don't know. Makes me want to resolve myself to be even stronger. I resolve to know.
it's too much sometimes to think about everybody because you see the Freed Hardeman, the just everything, and it's just like, hey, we need to, that's why we're autonomous. We need to work on us and keep it strong here so that we're not, because it's too much to go, wow, well they're going, oh man, we're all like, but I know that there's more out there than you see, but when you see it in whole, we're sick. We got leaven that needs to be purged.
And it's a really sad thing that a lot of it just appears to be show. Like, okay, they come for this lectureship, and then they present this grand message, and they seem like they're this huge giant. But then when it actually gets down to it, reality comes in where it's actually time for them to fight, and it's just like, okay, you're just somebody that's being propped up as an idol.
Mm-hmm.
As an icon, you actually don't have the strength.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of an illustration. Well, that happens in film. That happens in film all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You have a superhero and he's flaunted about as being somebody, and then actually comes time for him to prove himself, and he runs away scared.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what a lot of these gospel preachers are. They're just pulpiteers. They can put a sermon together and they sound really good, but when it actually comes time for them to deal with stuff, they won't do it. And it's a situation where when the rubber really meets the road, they're nowhere to be found.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when it comes time to correcting one another. And I was like, they can present sermons all day long about how, we need to stand against this and we need to oppose this, and so on and so forth. But then when it comes to their own family, they won't stand against it and oppose anything. But like you're saying, they try to find loopholes and make excuses. And that undermines and undercuts everything that we're trying to do. But of course, we don't see that with Paul or any of the other first century brethren. When they came to deal with matters, they dealt with it, and certainly because they're so close to death every day. Which, granted, we are too, but not in the same vein that they were. The Jews are hunting them down, and then the Gentiles are going to start hunting them down. The Romans are going to start hunting them down. So what do you better make sure that you're doing?
Staying right with
Yeah,
God.
they're staying pure. But we live in such a world of ease where we think death is not around every corner. And it's just like, so what's the big deal? Suffering does a lot
Mhm.
for a cause. And the fact that we have so little suffering, it's no wonder that our brotherhood's as sick as it is. All right, any other thoughts, comments? All right, that was good. I appreciate that.
Yes.
So we're looking here about the advice or expedience in the midst of this. So even here, as we're talking about things that individuals start coming up with, there are some brethren that actually say that Paul was married and that his wife died, making him a widower. Well, if that's the case, then I don't know necessarily that Paul would be saying this in this section. For I would that all men were even as I myself. Oh, really? You'd rather have my wife die and I be like you? No. Yeah, so it's just like, I really doubt, if that were the case, I really doubt Paul would be wishing that on anybody. So Paul's a single man. This is the advice that he's offering. This would be expedient. But he says, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, another after that. Paul has the self-control to where he's able to set aside these desires, whereas he's already established in verses 1 and 2 that you have some individuals that are not going to be able to do this. They are burning, and so he said it's better to marry than it is to burn. So single life is allowed as long as one can contain. Therefore, the question of one marrying is based on this. And the importance of morality, purity, is being discussed once more when Paul is discussing about each one having his proper gift, and one after this and one after that. So verse 8, I say therefore to the unmarried widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. So here's the first group that's being addressed. In view of the present distress, remain unmarried. It is good, not morally good or immoral, for you to get married. It is just in these circumstances, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. So it is okay to marry even in the present distress. Now, a bit of contextual exercise, since we're discussing previously about changing words and things of that nature. This word cannot says, but if they cannot contain, let them marry. What does this word mean?
Can you make it a definition a little bit? What do you mean?
Well, just
If they
when you
cannot.
think about it saying them, if they cannot contain,
They can't.
like just at all, they have absolutely no control.
Well, no, because we're going to come up to 10:13, which said, "No temptation has overtaken you, such as common to man, and God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able." So it's not in pot or like,
Go ahead and finish that word. No,
what do you mean?
you started a
Not
word.
impossible.
There you go.
Impossible.
Okay. So this doesn't mean that it's impossible for them to contain.
If they
can.
choose not to.
Okay. They have the option.
Mhm.
It's very clear they can contain. Now, the reason why I'm bringing that up is because this word helps us to define what a lot of individuals misuse in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 9. Whosoever is born of God does not commit sin, for his seed remains in him, and he cannot sin
Mm-hmm.
because he is born of God.
Mm-hmm.
People look at that word cannot because he's born of God to mean what?
Impossible.
All right, it's impossible for him to sin.
Calvinist say.
Okay, but we're seeing here, whosoever is born of God does not commit sin. Well, Paul is talking to a group of individuals that are born of God, and what's he saying to them? If you can do this, fine. But if you can't do this, then here's your other option. And he's impressing upon them the need to remain pure. So when we're looking at this and we're saying, so we go to 1 John 3:9, and the Calvinist wants to say, okay, you see there, he cannot sin, it's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all right, let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 9. They cannot contain. It's just impossible.
Do you have a Greek word? Is it specific to saying not impossible?
Actually, the opposite would be the case, but that's just how they're, for some reason, when they get into that section, that's just what their brain goes to. First, am I typing?
Yeah.
I'm not typing correctly. Not be first name. All right. I'm just gonna cursor over here. Don't see it. There it is. And we get the end of the linear. To be able or possible, be able, can do, cannot, could, may, might, be possible, be a power. So even with that, it's not a set in stone type of situation where it's showing that there's a possibility of committing sin or not committing sin. But it all boils down to the idea, as we said before, that okay, if somebody asks me to go out and drink with them, my response is going to be, I can't. Oh, you mean it's impossible? Well, no. Clearly it's possible. I could go with you. It's just that I can't because I'm a Christian and I have obligations. It's more of the word of ought. I ought not to.
How about choose?
Right. Yeah, I choose not to. Yeah, exactly.
Sounds like my brother George, when he quit drinking finally, and all his people were, his friends were coming down on him because he wasn't around the bar scene anymore. Then they were asking him to come down there, and he asked me, do you think I ought to go there and show them that I can, restrain myself from drinking? And I said, no, don't even enter the building. Don't even go there. Don't put yourself in that position. He wanted to go there to prove to them that he could be strong enough to resist. And I
We
just
just
said,
talk about that in Proverbs.
Yeah.
Yeah. About people want to say, oh, I can go towards her house. I'm tough.
yeah.
No, don't go.
No, I told him no, because the temptation. My brother George was, if you will, a celebrity in this area, well known, because he played in bands everywhere, up and down, everywhere. And when he went into a bar, he told me that he didn't even have to pay for anything. People would give him a shot and drink, a beer right off the bat. Right off the bat, he just walks in and he doesn't have to pay for nothing. And I was just like, huh, okay.
Get away.
Yeah, like that's really something to brag about.
No, and so after he became a Christian, if he in fact did, I hope he did, because I don't know, I'd like to talk to him some more. I mean, I think he's still alive, but he won't talk to me. I'll still wave at him, but he won't wave at me. Evil doers. But no, I didn't want him to put himself in that position and get tempted, but I'd sure like to talk to him again, if I can.
And that really is the thing about it is like people would look at that and they would say, well, just the fact of not being able to go here or not being able to go there. Like I mentioned this in the Proverbs, whole idea about being restrained. All right, yeah, there are plenty of restraints inside of Christianity, but it's the realization that we're being restrained because it's stuff that we do not need, that there just is no good about it. That even if you might gain some pleasure out of it, how much regret comes from it later. So it's being able to look beyond the immediate satisfaction to, you never think of what the other term is. There's immediate satisfaction and there, I guess it's delayed satisfaction. Just the idea of I could have now or put it towards, something that's going to help out later on. And it's so hard to see past the right now to the benefit of what could, end up coming later.
Delayed gratification.
Yeah, there it is. Thank you. So it's, it's the idea of spending now or saving for later. And it's just like you have to train yourself to realize that, okay, I just need to set this to the side so that I just don't have to have this right now. And be better for me to have something later. All right. So yeah, they cannot contain, let them marry. Verse 10. Now here's the second group. Unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. So here is something Jesus did address. This distress is not a reason for divorce. Verse 11. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So here's the situation. You're married, the wife departs, not for a reason of fornication, not for a reason of adultery, the present distress. What's the rule? Well, they should not depart, but if they do, the rule is you be reconciled to the husband. So right there, Paul is designating and he's determining, even though you've separated, you still have a husband somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that you're, just up and left and deserted, no. That's unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
But even with that being the case, that does not give you a liberty or a right or another avenue to be able to remove yourself from this and be able to marry to another. Now
It should be highlighted there, her husband, because it does state that it's still, even if you're separated, it's still
right,
showing here that it is her husband still.
right.
Well, I think too, what I've noticed is a lot of times when people take on the marriage, divorce, remarriage, they always, it seems like they put forth what the state has to say, the government has to say, well, now you're divorced, or he left, or this or that, instead of going to what God says, no, except for this, you still have a husband. This is your covenant relationship, and this does not go away just because the state hands you this decree of divorce and says, you're not legally bound by this person.
Or they try to make you feel guilty that so you want us to go get a divorce,
Right.
which is what we're not supposed to do, right? But it's like, well, it wasn't there in the first place.
Yeah. Now, so we'll get into a little bit of that as we move a little bit further into what Paul's going to say here, especially with this third group. So we've dealt with the widows and the unmarried, be unmarried, but if you are married and somebody ends up departing, you're not in a situation to remarry. Stay, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. So you stay single, or you come back to your original mate. Now, the third group. Verse 12, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. So here's the situation. You're not supposed to leave each other. You're supposed to stay. Now, here's the reason why this argumentation or these verses are being used. Verse 14. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. Now, with these words that I have underlined here, sanctified is used twice, unclean is used once. Who is probably asking these questions?
Christians.
All right.
They
From
were-
what background?
Corinthians.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, we're in Corinth, but inside of the church, you have two groups that are coming together.
the Jews and then
Okay.
Yeah.
Jews and Gentiles. Now, who's asking about this kind of stuff?
Jews.
All right. So here we have some implication. These questions are growing out of Jewish thinking
Mm-hmm.
because, well, let me ask you, why would they be thinking about this?
Because if you married a heathen, they'd be unclean.
All right. Under the Mosaic law, people would be unholy or unclean marrying a Gentile
Mm-hmm.
unless that Gentile were converted. You have a situation like Ruth, who comes in and says, my God, or your God's going to be my God. So she proselytes in, even though she's a Moabite. Now, Moses said, if you marry a Moabite and you have children, that to the 10th generation, those children weren't able to come to the congregation of the Lord. Well, that doesn't happen to Ruth because she converts. So that's the premise, that's the idea that we're working with here and why these questions are being asked. Okay? Here we have Jews and Gentiles are being brought together. A Christian marries a non-Christian. Under the Jewish way of thinking, it'd be, all right, we've got some limitations to put on you. There's a bit of a stigma that goes about this. But now Paul is addressing, he's saying, this is not like a Mosaic system. Now, of course, number one, we need to point out that this does not mean that the mate is sanctified in being a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Just because he's married to a woman that is a Christian does not make him a Christian. That's not the type of sanctification that we're talking about. This is in the context of, are we recognizing this marriage? Are we recognizing this union? Here's a believer and an unbeliever. What about their marriage? Paul says it is set apart, it is recognized by God, it is holy.
The marriage bed is
All right, undefiled. Now, what does this do to the very thing that Adrian was bringing up a moment ago about people that are out in the world? We have a section of brethren that says, well, these rules for marriage actually apply to Christians and not to non-Christians. So if you're a non-Christian and you enter into, however many marriages, they would ultimately say, well, God doesn't really recognize those. And that you can be baptized and just have everything be fixed. Well, Paul does away with that very idea in this section.
So the Great Commission is only for Christians that are already Christians?
Right. Yeah. So I mean, it's just like, so here's Paul saying. Paul is saying that God is watching and God recognizes that this is a marriage, even though one is not a Christian. So all of these people that are out here and they are being wedded together and they're not Christians, God recognizes those as being marriages because his laws and rules for marriage extend outside of the church. Everybody is amenable and is under God's rule. And even when it comes down to them putting away and remarrying, though they may be ignorant of his rules still apply. Then going into the discussion of children, therefore the children brought by it, they are clean. They're not to be looked at in any type of way. Because again, under the Old Testament system, you brought a child into this world from a heathen nation, there were certain things that he could not partake in, he or she could not partake in. But that's not how it is under the law of Christ. God recognizes the union as holy and right as long as it meets God's standards. If this is your first marriage and you're unbelievers, God recognizes it. If you're a Christian marrying a non-Christian, this is your first marriage, God recognizes it. There's no type of hindrances or boundaries to be set on this class of people just because it is that type of union.
And Peter, excuse me,
Yeah.
and Peter adds to that or confirms that when he talks about the wife can or by her own actions can basically help convert her husband. Right. So that would be an unequal, or if people tried to say that, but that marriage between a Christian and a non-Christian, is approved of.
That's right. And that's a good point to bring up because a lot of people say that, well, Paul and Peter are actually opposed to one another. Mm-hmm. And no, if you really look at their writings, they are confirming a lot of the same information. And that's a very good point. And Paul is going to bring up that same point in this section about why they should end up staying together. So we're looking at this third group. This is the same group, and I have it described as a fourth group, but it's the same group, but we're looking at it from the different standpoint of if the mate decides to leave. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband, or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? So here's the exact connection to what Jamie brought up just a moment ago with Peter. Peter's encouraging the wives that you can actually help convert your husbands apart from having the word presented to them by your manner of living. So when we're discussing this in verses 15 and 16, we're throwing another ingredient into all of this in the midst of this present stress. If the unbelieving depart, just let them depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. So we're looking at this from the standpoint of, here is a pagan married to a Christian. And this pagan refuses to live with the mate who has converted, and so the pagan wants to leave. All right, Paul says, let them leave. But we cannot forget that Paul has already encouraged them to stay together.
Also, I'd like to point out that because they're under distress in 26 there, that the person, a Christian has to remain a Christian no matter what.
That's right.
And this person doesn't want to have all the persecution and wants to leave. And so that's why they're allowed to be let loose too. Because you have to remain, and if they want to go, they're allowed to. But it doesn't give us the right to remarriage, and I think people try to use that as that, don't they?
Yeah, they do. But it's, it goes back to what Paul said a moment ago about, I don't speak, but the Lord speaks. If they leave, what are they to do?
Reconcile.
They're to remain unmarried and to be reconciled. But when we're considering, so even setting aside the present distress, you have a wife that is a Christian married to a non-Christian, and let's say that they both were, let's say the wife is actually a convert. Let's say they both were Baptist, but the wife comes out. And the husband is just so sick and tired of all of the changes that are taking place. And he's just, look, if this is how your life is going to be now, I don't want to have any part in it. And he just says, I'm leaving. All right. I mean, in that situation, certainly the wife should try to do what she can to encourage the husband to stay. But when it comes down to, okay, do I choose my husband or do I choose the church? You're not under bondage like that. Our responsibility, first and foremost, is to the keeping of the commandments. And that's what Paul is going to end up saying later on in this section. That is the ultimate goal. That no matter what condition you find yourself in, married, unmarried, circumcision, uncircumcision, slave or free, the goal is keeping the commandments. And if that is the main goal, what about a husband or a wife that chooses to leave? I don't want you to go, but if this is what you're going to do, certainly, what could you do? If the mate is just set on leaving, what are you going to do to stop him? Time up?
Jesus doesn't even do that with you.
Right. So it's like, just what now? Well, the question is about when this happens. What about when this happens? Well, as we said, some advocate this means the one being deserted can't remarry. Others say the word bondage means bound to the marriage, but not obligated to live in a situation like that. Not bound to the marriage so as to give up Christianity. You're not so bound so as to have to desert the Lord so as to uphold the marriage. And that is the position that I take on. That when Paul is discussing the idea of under bondage, that you are not a slave to your husband or to your wife. That even though it is a holy union, we have to remember that we're wedded to Christ. And that when it comes to giving up one or the other, even Jesus said, if you love your father or mother more than me, if you love your wife more than me, then you're not deserving to follow me.
Your version says hate.
Well, I'm actually thinking about Mark's.
Oh, okay.
I'm actually thinking about Matthew's account.
Oh.
Matthew uses, if you love more, I think it's either Mark or Luke, that changes it over to hate. So, just when we're thinking about this, and to a degree, in the midst of such a difficult situation where we, I would hate to ever be put in this position to where I would have to choose, but with this in mind, is there really even a choice? Mm-hmm. You're preparing yourself for the absolute worst. And when you are prepared like that, if it ever came to it, it's just like, okay, I already know what my choice is. I've already established it in my mind, and I've readied myself for when this is going to happen.
You're also setting the standard for if your wife does come back to
Right.
show that you're choosing God over, and that sets the example to them on how powerful your stance is.
Right. And not only for them, we've already been discussing about children that are brought into the mix. What is that establishing for the children?
Yeah, God first.
God first in all things.
Which would be Matthew 6:33.
That's right. Yeah, seeking first the kingdom. And in seeking first the kingdom, all these things will be granted unto you or given unto you. And, but it's just, it's one of those things like we're saying in our Proverbs study. You've got to already be running these things through your mind. Be running them through your head. Which, of course, nobody wants to think about this kind of stuff. But, I mean, whoever really does want to think about catastrophe happening? Nobody does. But if we're really going to be prepared about it, or be prepared for it, we've got to try to run some type of simulation through our head. So that when the time comes, if it ever does come, then we'll be ready. Now, another thing to take into consideration about this, when we're thinking about this fourth group, the unbelieving depart, not under bondage, let them go. What is an underlying possibility as we're looking at this from the standpoint of not so much the present distress, but here we are in Corinth. You have a Christian married to a non-Christian, a pagan. That pagan then decides to leave. What is that pagan more than likely going to end up doing?
Go back to the temple
All right.
and fornicate.
Okay. So as we're considering this and we're looking at it from the standpoint of, okay, not under bondage, she needs to remain unmarried, be reconciled. The reality of this is that a pagan who leaves for pagan worship, prostitution is practiced at the temple. Fornication is encouraged. So now a pagan leaves a Christian in such an atmosphere, it is 100% possible that this pagan would commit fornication and thus the marriage would be void. And in that situation where it's the wife, a wife is a Christian, husband leaves, and when he leaves, he commits fornication, she's free to remarry. Because it's not her fault. She hasn't done anything to, uproot or to disturb what's actually going on. It's just the husband's unwillingness to put up with what the new lifestyle is. And by him choosing to leave, by nothing that she's done wrong, she's not at fault. She would then, put herself in a position where she is free to remarry, and that's where Matthew chapter 5, 31 and 32 is going to come into play. It hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her writing of divorcement. So that's the Old Testament system. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery, or committed adultery. Now, why is this the case?
What Matthew scripture is that?
5, 31 and 32. Why is it the case that he is in fact causing her to commit adultery?
Because he's forcing her to
All right,
wait.
yeah. You're forcing her out, and you're withholding those very things that Paul has discussed in 1 Corinthians 7 that you're not supposed to withhold.
Mhm.
So you actually set up a stumbling block to her. And then you want to try to turn around and be like, okay, I got you. Now I'm going to remarry. No.
I just remember the word I had is accept.
Mhm.
What was your word? On 32?
But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication.
Yeah. So
Oh, except for fornication.
Well, I don't know that accept is going to hold the same bearing as the word saving.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just look it up right quick.
I think, because it kind of says it in John 3, right? Except, let me look at that.
Saving is. So it has accept. as a point of definition or a another defining word or in the definition. Saving without. So the word para is what makes it side by side. Let's look at ektos. Aside from, besides, but except, accepted, other than, out of, aside, unless, without. Ek. Well, yeah, ultimately, it is going to be the same situation, except for fornication. But the only difference is that when you have that word save in there, the idea that he is saving for this or hoping for this shows the intent of the husband that, okay, you're putting her out and waiting for her to slip up so that you can then turn around and say, okay, we got you for fornication. And try to justify, yourself. But in that situation, neither of them would be innocent in that. The wife would need to try to contain and try to hold off as long as she can. But you have situations where this kind of stuff comes up, where people are so desperate to get out of it, but they know what the scriptures say about it. They cannot just get out of it for any reason, and so they pull stunts like this. When in that situation, so when we're thinking about it from that standpoint, is it wrong? Is it wrong to separate? I would think if things are just decaying so badly, and it's just like, look, we can't stay with each other anymore. Hey, fine, separate, but you can't be married. Now, when you came together, you're still breaking a covenant that you made to one another. But in doing that, you've got to realize, okay, we've got to stay celibate. It's no different. So we've had individuals, again, how we present this on television, we've had individuals that constantly want to bring up, well, what about a wife that's being abused by her husband? We never said that you have to stay in a marriage no matter what. You can separate for anything, but separating does not give you a right to remarry. And a wife that's being abused by her husband, she has absolutely zero reason to stay. But that's not a reason to remarry, to get a divorce. Separate, get away, but that's still your husband. Now, and so even as we're thinking about, from this standpoint, the mate that is putting away, and we're looking at this and we're saying, what's the possibility that they're actually going to go out and, commit fornication? It's very high. And so what about situations like that today where you have a husband and he just up and says, look, I want a divorce. More than likely, he's already got somebody on the side and you don't know about it. Now, a lot of brethren would look at that and say, well, the divorce itself was not for adultery. Well, if I can prove it later, I don't care what the government says. This goes back to Jamie's point. A lot of our brethren get hooked up on, well, what does the paper say? I really don't care what the paper says, because I know the government doesn't care. They're just looking at it from the standpoint of, we want to be able to disperse your goods. So if a husband and a wife, and they end up separating, and let's say it's like, the husband that says, I want the divorce, and the wife is fighting it, and let's say the church gets involved and they start asking, have you been unfaithful? What's going on here? It's just, no, I haven't been unfaithful. Have you been upholding your responsibilities? Yes, I've been upholding my responsibilities. I don't understand why he's wanting to leave. They go before the court, he gets the piece of paper, and then, I don't know, a month later, he's with somebody else. More than likely, he was already with her when all of this started unfolding. So what about this, this woman that's just been put away? The rule is, if you're separating, stay unmarried and be reconciled. Well, he didn't do that. So forget about what he took her to court for. This is actually put a null and void to the marriage. But you'd have a lot of brethren that would say, no, neither of them can get remarried. And to that I say nonsense. Because I'm not going to start letting the courts dictate and start overruling what the scriptures actually say. I understand Romans chapter 13 that we're to obey the powers that be, but I have responsibility to obey God rather than man. And anything that the government ends up doing that puts a heavier burden on my brethren, I'm not going to follow that. And like we have brethren, I know of brethren that have been living a celibate life, and after hearing of the situation and it's laid out like that, it's just like they could have remarried a long time ago. And it's like it is very unfortunate just how brethren get mixed up on this kind of stuff, and they inadvertently end up ruining people's lives. So which is why it's needful to go through these types of studies and deal with all sides of it and view what's transpiring here. So let's see here. Where was I? So we're discussing the likely would happen that pagan would go back into paganism, fornicate, annul the marriage. But if it did not happen, then the one who put her away is not free to remarry. That pagan, he's not able to remarry either. But as we said, might it not be possible, then in Corinth, the pagan leaving the mate, the likelihood is they would be unfaithful. The mate then is not bound. So we're looking at this from the situation. It could be one or the two as to how this is actually going to unfold. It might be that the believer's not bound to stay if it means giving up Christianity. Or the problem of fornication in Corinth, if the pagan left and committed fornication, the believing mate would not be guilty of Matthew 5:31. She's not waiting for him to do this. He's just up and doing it, thus not being bound to the marriage. But verse 16 definitely comes into play when we're considering, the consideration before separating. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? It may be extremely difficult, which granted in the situation of Corinth, I could see how it would be difficult. And especially if your mate is a pagan and all the associations that pagan worship have. But still, you're fighting this out. Stick with it, stay with it, because you never know what the outcome might be. Yeah, they might leave, but at the same time they might convert. It's unfortunate the ratio is not equal. More times than not, the mate does end up leaving instead of actually converting. But verse 17, he says again, but as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all the churches. Ultimately, no matter what, this is what the focus is. Here are people, Jew, Gentile, they become Christians. As he's going to discuss in a minute, one is a slave, one is a master. What do? Let him walk. No matter what your situation is, you try to serve Christ. And Paul says, and so ordain I in all churches. This is the bottom line across the board. No matter what it is, no matter what you're struggling through, what you're having to endure, as we said, Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, keep the kingdom first. And in keeping the kingdom first, everything will be eventually worked out in the end. So we'll stop there at verse 17 because that's going to lead us into a new section that we really don't have time to get into at this point. But Paul's going to bring up slaves in this chapter, which I know is a difficult situation given our country and current climate. But if we look at this situation from the standpoint of how the Bible actually presents it, It's not really all that difficult. So we'll say that for later. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Short pause.